Right, this meeting is being recorded, I will remind you. That's what it says on the screen as well, so it must be true. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker of this evening, John Hodgson. John is well known to most of you as a member of the Anglo-Albanian Association, but also as a speaker on several occasions in the past. He has particular insights into the works of Ismail Kadare, and The Doll, the subject of this evening's talk, is the sixth work by Kadare that John has translated into English. I don't need to tell you that Kadare is by far the best known writer living in Albania today. There is much about John's talk which I shall be listening out for. The fact that this book is, at least to an extent, autobiographical is clear to anyone who dips into it, and the fact that it is all about Gjirokastra, as well as being about Kadare, is nicely complemented by the talk about the city's architecture, which Louise Schofield gave us a few months ago. John Hodgson's career has been all about teaching, translating, interpreting, and writing his own works. And the Albanian language is, of course, his special preserve. His involvement with Albania and Kosovo began in the 1980s when he was teaching at universities in Tirana and Pristina. The aftermath of the war in the 1990s brought him to The Hague, where he had a key role as an interpreter in the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a process which led to the indicting of Milosevic. It must be said that John has been on the front line of these important events in the Balkans. John has asked me to tell you about his own recent book called, quotes, The Future in the Past, end quotes, which he has written in Albanian. It is his recollection of events in Kosovo during the 1980s. John would be happy to supply anyone here this evening, anyone interested in a copy of the book, and this will be provided free of charge. If you want to receive a copy of John's book, please email us on Anglo-Albanian, that's one word, lowercase, Anglo-Albanian with an N at the end of the two words together, at gmail.com, Anglo-Albanian@gmail.com. John will speak for around 40 minutes, slightly less, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers for around 20 minutes. I also wanted to mention our next event. This is a talk by the new British ambassador to Albania, Alistair King-Smith, who will be giving us his first impressions of Albania. This will take place on or near the 26th of November. And as our contribution to Flag Day, Dita e Flamurit, this will provide you with an on-the-spot view of Albania through the eyes of our man in Tirana. Finally, if you are not a member of the AAA, I urge you to take the step to AAA membership by emailing our membership secretary on the same email address, angloalbanian@gmail.com. And with that, over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this introduction. And it's lovely to see many, many familiar faces all in your little virtual screens here. And I'd also like to introduce Phil Logarezzi here, because we are going to do a double act this evening. And I'm going to talk a little bit about The Doll. And Phil is going to be reading extracts. So there are two of us on the platform this evening. And here we are. Ismail Kadare's The Doll, which is a slender book, but not a slight one. It's the most recent of all his books and very possibly his last. For Kadare has now announced that he will write no more, not that writers are to be trusted in such statements. Here in Britain, The doll has been marketed as a novel, but the author calls the book simply A Portrait of My Mother, and he does not turn her into fiction, although he possibly creates around her a kind of personal mythology. This little book has a huge time span. Kadare loves a great historical sweep, even in a short number of pages. In his novella, The Generations of the Hankanats, he covers several centuries of a Girocastra family, possibly based on his own, in 50 pages, a sort of high compression Forsyte saga. And so the doll grows out of a rich historical soil in the city, in the history of the 300-year-old Kadare house, with the traditions and achievements of Kadare ancestors, and the arrival of Kadare's grandmother in the house as a young bride in 1896. The narrative takes us up to the year 2008 and the restoration of the house. The story proper begins with the wedding of Kadare's mother in 1933 and finds her and her own entry into this vast, ancient, and inhospitable family home. The marriage is an old-fashioned diplomatic match between prominent Girocastra families with an unspoken rationale behind it. The Kadares are distinguished, pretentious even, but their house is going to rack and ruin. The Dolby family, also an old Girocastra family, are considerably better off. Yet it is also a touching love match. Kadare's portrait of his mother is not one of obvious love and affection, and many readers have found it harsh and unfilial. This lady, who remains unnamed throughout the book and is referred to only as the doll, is a remote, delicate, and inhibited figure. As a small boy at school, Ismail finds that his mother is different from others.
I realized very quickly that I too had a problem with my mother, but of a very different kind. It had to do mainly with her fragility, with what would later strike me as her resemblance to paper or plaster of Paris. At first dimly, but with increasing clarity, I understood what the maternal things mentioned in the poems and songs. Milk, breasts, fragrance, and warmth were hard to relate to my own mother. It wasn't a matter of coldness. Her sensitivity was evident, and her caring nature too. Something else was missing, and I came to understand that it had to do with her self-restraint, her inability to cross a certain barrier. In short, from an early age, I felt that my mother was less like the mothers in the poems and more a kind of draft mother or an outline sketch which she couldn't step beyond. Even her white face had the frozen and inscrutable quality of a mask, especially when glazed with panstick, as she had learned from Kiko Pinoya, the famous makeup artist of the brides of Girocastra, whose house was almost adjacent to our own. Later, when on a trip to Japan, I saw a performance of kabuki for the first time. The whiteness of the actors' faces seemed familiar to me. They contained the same secret as my mother's, a doll-like mystery, but without terror.
Women in Kadare's books are often remote and wraith-like, beautiful but inaccessible, and possessing some mystical secret. This plaster mask is a haunting and disturbing motif throughout his work. In The Three-Arched Bridge, a retelling of the ancient Albanian myth of a sacrificial victim immured during the construction of a bridge, a woman is literally encased in plaster. In The Accident, where Rowena is the elegant and sophisticated young lady, she is seen as a pale visitor from another dimension. We think of Dorantina, raised from the grave in the novel known in English as The Ghost Rider. Yet this book is also a tribute to this strangely enigmatic mother. The doll is not an educated woman and is touchingly naive in the ways of the world. Kadare recalls with shame his occasional outbursts of arrogance and unkindness towards her. Yet he is aware of the primal nature of their relationship. The author recalls a dinner with the Russian poet Andrei Vosnesensky, one of whose poems describes the maternal womb as the origin of all things.
It included a line in which the Russian for mother, mat, was repeated 3 times, mat, 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 but left unfinished on the 4th repetition, ma, which at the end associated the T of the 3rd mat, mother, made the word timar, meaning darkness. Vosnesensky was in very low spirits at that dinner, and to me, this seemed to influence his interpretation of these lines. It was my first and last meeting with him, so I had no chance to explore further what he meant. But his explanation, more or less, involved a connection between the words mother and darkness, because a child emerges from its mother's womb as if out of darkness, an endless cycle of matma, mother darkness, in which both the mother and the darkness remain beyond understanding.
Kadare's father, an official at the Gjirokastra district court, whose preoccupation in life is the repair and upkeep of the rambling house, is in contrast a straightforward and benign presence. When Kadare goes to study in Moscow, this is the end of the 1950s, he becomes acquainted with Freudian psychology, an alluring and taboo subject in the Soviet Union, let alone Albania. But he finds the idea of an Oedipal struggle with his mild-mannered father a non-starter. Instead, it is the intense but understated relationship with his mother that dominates his imagination. And indeed, Kadare finds in his doll-like mother the source of his writer's gift.
I knew it was still more impossible to tell her that not only did her limitations not hem me in, but as the years passed, I had grown to appreciate these frailties as a sign of her superiority. I came to think that it was precisely from her skewed analysis of the appearance of the world, from this blurred and perverse reasoning, in short, from this determination not to let go of the nature of a child, that what was called the writer's gift was born. I felt less the son of a mother than of a 17-year-old girl whose growth had been arrested. Sometimes it seemed to me that everything that had harmed the doll in life became useful to me in my art. Indeed, I almost started to believe that she'd accepted her own self-impairment in order to be useful to me. She surrendered the freedom and authority of a mother. In short, turned herself into a doll to give me all possible liberty as a human being in a world where freedom was so rare and hard to find, like crusts of ration bread in the time of the Germans, which she broke off from her own small portion and secretly gave to me.
And so this slim book is not only Kadare's portrait of his mother, but also an autobiography of his birth and growth as an artist. He glances at many of the themes and scenes that are familiar from his major novels, and we experience with the writer the growth of his imagination, and rather more hesitantly and irregularly, his first steps in the practice of his craft, which are presented absurdly and with self-mockery. And so we have a surreal portrayal of the ancient city of Gjirokastra and the effects of war and geopolitics on this provincial backwater, glanced at in passing in largely humorous and grotesque terms. And we also have Kadare's own journey through the landscape of Albanian history, his education in Moscow, his writer's life in Tirana, where his parents also come to live, and his eventual flight to Paris. The brooding presence of the Kadare house in Gjirokastra haunts the book.
If anyone had asked me what my house looked like, I wouldn't have known how to reply. This stemmed from a feeling that I dared not to confess to anyone. A part of the house appeared to me unreal. This was not a matter of imagination and fantasy, but of totally tangible spaces. On the second floor, for instance, behind the room with the fireplace, or the winter room, as we called it, there were two unfinished partitions left after the most recent repair of 1936. I had long understood that every repair project spawned one or two more rooms, or the reverse, swallowed a couple. Shut up with temporary doors, nailed with two crossed planks, these chambers always attracted me. Beyond the planks, you could see rafters and half-finished windows in a beautiful, soft, falling light, especially in the afternoon. These were not yet rooms, but sort of, and not yet spaces, and nameless embryos of this kind filled our house. The summer room, the winter corner, the balcony room, the big gallery, or the little gallery. I was impatient for these rooms to be born after such a long gestation, even if I realized that my father's sole desire in life, the next repair, would never be totally fulfilled.
The city of Gjirokastra, with its white stone houses piled high almost on top of one another, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Kadare house has been meticulously restored and opened as a museum. I visited it in 2016 when a whole fleet of Kadare translators were invited to Tirana for a conference organized by the Academy of Sciences to mark the writer's 80th birthday. We had a wonderful time, all chatting together in our funny Albanian, and in Gjirokastra we were serenaded by a group of polyphonic singers over lunch before inspecting the house with its beautifully carved ceilings, balconies, courtyards, and views over the city. But Kadare's sister whispered in my ear, "I preferred the house as it was." Readers of Chronicle in Stone will recall the surreal evocation of wartime Gjirokastra from the viewpoint of a child. And this is a vein that Kadare taps once again in the later novel known in English as The Fall of the Stone City. In Kadare's hands, the city becomes transfigured, grotesquely and comically, but with affection. The city is a matriarchy and famous for its stern and tyrannical old ladies, one of whom is Kadare's grandmother, the doll's mother-in-law. Towards the end of her life, Kadare's grandmother decides that she will no longer leave the house. This, in the city's tradition, is a sign of status, a kind of social promotion. In The Fall of the Stone City, Kadare describes how the grand, secluded ladies of Gjirokastra tried to maintain their dignity into the new post-war era, but were ultimately defeated by the forces of socialism.
It was just after midnight on the 17th of December when Madame Ganimede of the House of the Hankanats, dressed in her winter fur coat, tottered in her high heels across the intersection of Varosh Street and the road to the Lycée, when a woman greeted her from her right-hand side. "Good morning, Comrade Ganimede." The lady so addressed stopped in her tracks, as if struck by a blow. There for a moment, she remained in the middle of the crossroads, and then slowly, as if trying to identify her assailant, attempted to turn her head. But her neck would not obey her. "It's me, Comrade Ganimede. I'm Rosie from the neighborhood committee. Are you coming along to the meeting tomorrow?" Rosie's quarry remained rooted to the spot. Then she raised her hand as if in search of support and lifted it to her chest. Her knees trembled and she collapsed on the cobblestones. Some passers-by contacted the hospital, which sent its only ambulance at once. This was merely the start. Now that a hitherto unsuspected method of bringing down the indomitable ladies had been found, it was open season everywhere. Like seagulls at the end of their lifespan, the ladies of the city fell one after another wherever they were caught by the fatal cry of "Comrade!" The same scene was repeated. First, they froze on the spot and reached out a despairing arm, as if for support from some kind gentleman. "Sir, your arm, please." Then there was an attempt to see where the blow had come from. A catch of the breath, a trembling at the knees, followed by collapse.
And here I'd like to digress a bit from the doll, because if I tell you too much about what's in it, you won't read it, and talk a little bit about a little noticed side of Kadare. We are used to think of Kadare, the myth maker, the devious writer outwitting the censor, the allegorist, but I'd like to draw out here his love of urban sophistication. In Albanian, the doll was published as part of a much larger volume of essays and stories, Mornings in the Café Rostand, the renowned literary cafe in Paris, where indeed the book was born. For Kadare's recent books have all been written in 90-minute stints over morning coffee. This is the kind of milieu which Kadare has always yearned for. Even back in communist Albania, Kadare created in his books a glittering capital out of the sleepy and ill-lit city of Tirana, with traffic, neon lights, bustle, and artistic society. This longing for the big city is taken to an extreme by Linda in A Girl in Exile. Here, a young woman interned in an appalling little provincial town dreams of Tirana and nurtures a fantasy relationship with a writer from the capital. This kind of longing for the city was something new in Albanian literature, which traditionally has been preoccupied with themes of patriotic struggle, the harshness of rural life, and the romance of the highlands. Kadare is having none of that. The countryside in his books is invariably wretched and depressing, and there are the doom-laden, accursed mountains in broken April. I can't offhand think of any attractive natural landscapes at all. In his little book about the collapse of communism, published in English as Albanian Spring, Kadare recalls being sent with other intellectuals to hoe turnips in the dismal swamps of the coastal region of Muzece, to a village with the odd and suggestive name of Ndananas, among mothers, in the hope that working alongside the cooperativist peasantry might strengthen his class consciousness. The expedition was not a success. Kadare sets his face firmly against the pickaxe and rifle traditions of Albanian literature, some of it socialist realist and some of it not. After I had translated The Accident, a lot of which takes place among smart hotels in Europe, I mentioned to the author that there was a lot of luxury in the book. "I'm glad you noticed that," he said. "I don't want Albanian literature to be just about mud." This taste for the metropolis also comes from his mother. The doll, after she moves to Tirana, is an unexpected social success in artistic and literary circles and acquires a taste for the big city.
The doll was attracted not just by the theatre, but by the view of the Hotel Daiti opposite, especially on the days when there were official receptions, stylish cars, foreign ladies getting out of them, what you might call all that glamour. Her panoramic view would include the arcade of Luigi Curacucci Street, the Palace of Culture, the Clock Tower Cafe, where my father drank his morning coffee and from where the doll surely wouldn't want to be seen. And then the National Theatre and Writers Club, from where she would also not want me to see her. And then the art gallery, and finally the Hotel Daiti itself. This was a map of her beau monde through which she moved, as if escorted by an unidentified companion, whether my father, me, all of us, or perhaps her alter ego.
When the Kadares relocate to Tirana, they leave behind the great house with its weight of tradition and move into two small city flats. These standardized little boxes are featureless and less burdened by the past. But the Kadare flat in Tirana is also worth mentioning because it too has become a museum, perhaps an even more atmospheric one than the old house in Gjirokastra. The Kadare flat is on Dibra Street, just behind the Palace of Culture on Skanderbeg Square in the heart of the city. This was a privileged location, and the apartment block designed by Max Velo, which now looks dull and inconspicuous, was in the 1970s a radical architectural departure and known as the Palace of Cubes. The residents of the building were distinguished artists and members of the nomenclatura. Dritro Agoli lived on the floor above. The flats were more generous and spacious than usual. This was not the block, the celebrated secluded neighborhood where the leadership lived, but it was the next best thing. The apartment has been preserved with the Kadare's own furniture and a large part of their books, and is particularly atmospheric as an evocation of life in communist Tirana, an era that now seems more remote than 19th century Gjirokastra. Few people want to remember this time. Most Tirana families have thrown out the furniture from this era, and so the effort to preserve this apartment in such a thoughtful way is particularly imaginative and welcome. Literary events take place there, and groups of school children go to see how their grandparents lived. A few weeks before the single-party regime in Albania cracked and collapsed in 1990, Kadare sought political asylum in France. And it was in this apartment that the doll sat listening to the radio announcement of her son's defection. I too remember this brief statement, for I was working for the American government's monitoring service at the time. It was slipped into the lunchtime news. Ismail Kadare desertoi. Ismail Kadare has deserted, and followed by the usual positive news from the cooperative farms. In Tirana, prosecutors came to search the apartment, and the doll, by this time aged about 80, threatened them with a pistol. But her comment to her son, after he was granted sanctuary in France, was characteristically trenchant.
Are you a Frenchman now?
The doll ends with the destruction by fire and subsequent rebuilding of the old house in Gjirokastra, and with Kadare leading across the threshold for the first time his wife Elena. Elena Kadare is a writer herself, the first Albanian woman to have published a novel, and the author of many screenplays. She also deals with Ismail Kadare's relations with the outside world, for he writes his novels in longhand and doesn't use a computer. Recently, Elena Kadare published her own memoirs, Insufficient Time, and here is the description of the reconstruction of the Gjirokastra house in her words.
It was indeed sad that the ancient house, one of the oldest in the city, should burn down in such a banal fashion after surviving so many centuries. As ever, there was no shortage of speculation, encouraged by the fact that none of the tenants had been in the house on the night of the fire. It wasn't clear to Ismail who they were or how many. A long time ago, he had made a public statement donating his house to the municipality, which could do with it what it wished. I was sorry that on my few trips to Gjirokastra, I had never had a chance to gain a full impression of the house. The continually changing tenants had made changes to it. Ismail had told me, half joking, that the house was of the sort that under each repair swallowed one or two rooms or spawned a couple. I was particularly sorry that our daughters had never had a chance to see it. One October day in 2008, Ismail and I went to visit the house. It had been restored exactly according to the plans that the architect had drawn up on the basis of the old walls and photographs from the beginning of the last century. And the house retained its brooding, fortress-like appearance. As we climbed to the upper floor, I met with a great surprise. In the corridor, in front of the great reception room, stood 7 or 8 singers in a semicircle, wearing the traditional fustanella. As soon as I stepped on the last tread of the stairs, which still lacked a banister, the singers, their eyes on me, began a polyphonic song of breathtaking beauty. My emotions did not let me concentrate enough to understand the words. They were in the tradition of the famous wedding songs of Gjirokastra, and the meaning was more or less this. Finally, Elena, after such delay and on so many years, you have set foot in your husband's house.
And here I'd like to end my description of this little book, which I think will come to be seen as a gentle, meditative, and highly personal appendage coming at the end of a long creative life. And if there are any budding writers here this evening, Kadare's advice to them might be that 90 minutes each morning in a cafe will, over many decades, result in a shelf full of substantial novels. That's all I had to say, and thank you very much, Phil, for your fine reading. And
Yulutem, Yulutem.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was a brilliant talk, and I think both of you have really fulfilled this picture and created this wonderful picture of the Kadare family in Gjirokastër. And thank you so very much. Now, I'm sure we've got questions to put to you, John, and maybe to you, Bill. Go ahead with questions, please. Okay, can I just ask one to set the ball rolling? In the book, there is mention of this strange sort of room in the house which acted as a sort of courtroom, and that they had, or they took upon themselves some sort of legal responsibility. Can you say something about that, John? Because it seemed to me very unusual and something worthy of comment.
Yes, it is extremely unusual. They have a prison or a family prison, or what they call the dungeon in the house, and this is not explained at all, except that Kadare's family has a kind of legal background, and clearly there were disputes in the family, and a member of the family could actually be confined in this space, but it's not otherwise explained in the book. But so that's really all I can say about it.
Yes, very unusual. More questions, please. I'm looking on the chat as well, but I don't see any
I think
real questions.
we've got Neil Taylor's got his up, Stephen.
All right, very good.
And then after that, it's
Neil.
I was just interested in what we call his sort of defection in 1990, but that was right at the end of the socialist period when one could sort of look forward to a change. And I wondered why he defected then and why, I'm not sure when he in fact came back to Albania and what affected that decision.
I think he had a sense that the communist regime might turn extremely savage in its death throes, that it could end very, very badly indeed, and that he had held out long enough. And also, I think that his defection to Paris could provide a slight impetus for change. It could precipitate something. He describes this to some extent in his little book, Albanian Spring, known as From One December to the Next in Albanian. And as for coming back, he, as soon as a democratic system was established in the country, he was free to go back, and he was encouraged and welcomed back. And I think it took about 2 or 3 years, around about 1993, before he visited again.
Thank you.
I think it's Gzim next, is it?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, John and Philip. John, it was fascinating to hear what you have to say about the doll, and I'm delighted to see that Kadare finally is writing something more personal in view of how much he has written about the past in Albania and the myths and so on and so forth, because I think this element of his personal hasn't been as straightforward as it is in the doll. We have seen more or less Kadare between the lines as a person rather than about his family. And I wonder if, if he has made any attempt to write about his family or how he understood personally his well, you mentioned that when he went to Russia, he was influenced by Freud, but I suppose, was it at that time that he finally got in touch with Freud and the Oedipus complex, or did he want to do something like this during communism and he refrained himself? And the other thing is, I wonder from your contact with Kadare, what does he think about the fact that the Nobel Committee are still being a bit blinkered and not recognizing one of the greatest writers of our time? We have all kinds of writers who are obscure, and we learn about them suddenly when they are given the Nobel Prize. And I'm not saying that giving a Nobel Prize, establishes one's reputation, but it is something that people like Kadare, I think, deserve. I'm not speaking as an Albanian. And I wonder, from your knowledge of Kadare, what does he think about it? And is it possible, even at this stage, that something is done in terms of strengthening the lobbying for Kadare to achieve this high and fully deserved accolade?
I think, first, as regards putting himself in his books, there's, as you say, his personality comes through very much between the lines in everything that he has written, rather than directly. His wife's memoirs have a lot of him in them, and I think there's a certain. Well, Thomas Hardy had his wife write his own biography, and there's a sense that Eleanor is telling Kadare's personal story for him in many parts of that book. So his personal history, there is a lot of that. As for when he came to read Freud or to become acquainted with Freud, this was part of his time in Moscow, that he arrived in Moscow to study at the Gorky Institute for Literature in about, I think, 1959. And this was a time when the Khrushchev thaw had established a much more liberal atmosphere in Moscow. And the atmosphere was certainly much more liberal than it was in Tirana. And Kadare found Moscow very liberating. And there were intellectual currents. There was the Pasternak affair going on. And there was a lot of underground literature. It was a very exciting time to be in Moscow. And he came back early because Albania broke with the Soviet Union, and all its students had been sent to Moscow were obliged to return home. So he looks back to Moscow as a time of nostalgia, and that was a time when he got to know things about Freud, about James Joyce and Proust and Kafka. The Nobel Prize, this poor man has been pursued by this question of when are you going to get the Nobel Prize? And of course, it's not in his hands. And there has been a great deal of speculation about it. And some people have taken offense that Albania has not been, there's something anti-Albanian about it. And really, he would like to be left in peace on this question. When he came to London, he was asked at a Foyle's reading, when are you going to get the Nobel Prize? And of course, what do you say? Poor man, I think he would like to be left in peace on this question.
I just say very quickly, thank you very much, obviously,
Thank
John
you.
and Philip. In relation to Kadare leaving Albania, from my recollection is that was in October 1990, when things were very febrile. Hodge's statue wasn't toppled until February the following year, and I think when Kadare left, it was still illegal. And if he'd been caught doing so, he would have been in a lot of trouble. I was in Tirana a few years ago looking at the National Historical Museum, and the last person to be shot fleeing from Albania was in 1990. So he was taking a big risk in leaving, and I think, as John said, he probably thought that the revolution, of would like to call it, could turn very nasty indeed. In fact, even in February 91, when they were pulling down the statue, the police opened fire on some of the demonstrators to begin with. But can I just get it clear? Is he still living in France, or is he living back in Albania, or is he moving between the two?
He moves between the two. He has his little flat in Paris, and he has a flat in Tirana, and a nice house by the sea in Durrës.
Sorry,
I think you're quite right about what you say about 1990. I mean, by that time the atmosphere was very, very tense. Certain things had happened. There had been the exodus through the embassies in June 1990, and there was a general sense that the days of the Communist Party were numbered. But the student demonstrations and the formation of the first opposition parties, that didn't happen until after Kadare had left. It happened in December 1990. So there was a sense in October of when he went of waiting for something to happen, and nobody quite knew what.
Yeah, I think I was in Albania in June 1990, and I saw the embassies and huge crowds of people camping out in the grounds of the various embassies. But people I spoke to there, and people who were prepared to speak to me, were very conscious of Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968. Obviously, the Soviet Union wasn't going to get involved, but the way that risings against communist rule had been put down very savagely in the past was certainly in the forefront of quite a lot of people. I dare say it was with Kadare as well.
I could say something about 1991. I was in Albania. I've just returned from Cairo, so it's just 9 months I stayed there, and I left Albania again just a few months after Kadare. And we were a bit surprised, to be frank with you, that he left, because at that time, yes, I mean, there were a number of intellectuals who were writing articles. But and even Salih Berisha appeared a bit later, as it were. But all the hopes were that someone with Kadare's caliber who would step in, and people didn't understand that Kadare is not cut out to be a politician. But I think he had the farsightedness to understand that the kind of changes that Albanians were looking forward to, they were not coming. And even when they came, it's not that the communists wanted to do that, they were forced as a result of what happened. So I think to some extent his departure did play a role, although I don't think this has been acknowledged properly so far.
Yeah, I understand he's been asked on a number of occasions by various parties in Albania to become a politician, or even to put himself forward as president, but he's always declined. That's what I've heard. That's true or not, I don't know, but he certainly, I gather, declined to do so.
Yes, that's certainly true, and he's very combative in political life, not necessarily in party politics, but he's very combative in culture wars about Skanderbeg, for instance, about the position of Skanderbeg or the role of Islam in Albanian history. He's very ready to take up the cudgels.
John, could you say a few words about his attitude to Skanderbeg?
Well, he's a great supporter of Skanderbeg. That he thinks that Skanderbeg is very much the national hero, a unifying hero, and he's gets upset when other people try to historically reinterpret Skanderbeg and to see him as a myth that was created principally by the 19th century national Renaissance.
Hmm.
I think we've got John Watkins with his hand up. Oh, John, I think you might be on mute. Try again. No, we can't hear you. Okay, I think he's throwing in the towel.
Write it in the chat.
Yes, exactly.
And then after that, I think we've got Gabriel.
We've got what, Arba? Didn't hear that.
We've got Gabriel Partos.
All right, right.
After that. But John, if you want to write, in fact, Gabriel, if you want to start us off, and then by that time, John may have written his question.
Yes, please. Yes, John, could you tell us a little bit about Kadare's ability during the worst periods of Hodge's rule to be able to publish his works? And I mean, to us, some of the metaphors and are so obvious, the political message, and yet he was able to get away with so much. What was behind it? What was driving that? Why was he so skillful?
This is how extraordinary devious he was. That they're obvious now, but they weren't quite so obvious at the time. And there are quite a lot of Kadare extracts and books, which now, if you read them, they have a totally different meaning from they had when you were, if you read them in 1970 or 1980. Just as a very simple example of this, he wrote a poem about the Albanian stand at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And this contains the line, visitor, come and see what happens to a country when a communist party is born. Mm. And if you read if you read that in 1970 and if you read that in 2000, it just has a totally opposite meaning. And a lot of his books are like that, that they hide dissent in plain sight. And he was very, very skilled at taking up taboo and difficult themes. There is another of his stories, and I can't remember what it's called, but it describes members of the former, the pre-war government and members of nationalist groups from World War II. And these are are exiled and interned in some dreadful village in the mountains. And he describes them living their lives and hoping for the overthrow of communism. And this was a very, very difficult theme to tackle, to write about people like that. And here again, if you read it at that time, it seemed to be a socialist realist story mocking these people who hoped for the overthrow of communism. Now, when you read it, it seems that, yes, here he is, hoping for the overthrow of communism. And the Tirana readership at the time were very, very skilled in decoding Kadare. This was not obvious to, I think, to foreign readers. It wasn't obvious to readers in Kosovo. But the Tirana intelligentsia would read Kadare carefully and notice what he had managed to get past the censor.
John, there's a question here from John Watkins, who you know, presumably. He's the editor of our online newsletter, Gazette. The question is, how was it for you as a translator? Kadare is known for his use of language, creating his own words, etc. Is this also true of the doll? Is its language complex?
Yes, it is. The doll has quite a complex and involved style, which is late Kadare, because he didn't start like this. His early novels are very, very lucid, very plain, vivid. And when he began as a novelist, the Albanian literary language had really only recently been established and standardized, and it was his books that really set standards and became a style for other writers to follow. Recently, I would say in the past, second half of his career, he has been much more experimental. He has created new words, and he has explored Albanian roots, and his style is quite idiosyncratic. And now a Kadare sentence may well look like nobody else's.
Right. Any more questions? Well, we've got a message from Michael Gunn saying, John and Phil, thank you very much for your talk this evening. Very enjoyable, must leave. Natne Mir from Brian Ferris to everyone. Thank you from Rob Wilton. Thank you so much, John, and sincere compliments. So maybe the time has come when we will draw the evening to a close, which we said we would do after 20 minutes. Somebody is saying, Rob Wilton is saying, perhaps I can offer some Kadare poetry sometime. Well, yes, indeed. Why not? We'll hold him to that.
Yes.
But if there are no more questions, I'll say first, John, this has been a remarkable evening and one that I will certainly remember. And when I said it was in the publicity that this was going to be a treat, it was indeed a treat to hear you talking about Kadare and about the doll as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it myself, and you know, it brought back so much of the atmosphere of Gjirokastër as well. And also many thanks to Phil. And I thought this idea of having another voice, another person on the screen, and Phil handled it extremely well, and I really enjoyed hearing him his contribution. I thought that was a great success. Arber, we obviously thank Arber again that the whole thing has happened according to the plan. I mean, most of you might not know that Arber is actually sitting in Istanbul at the moment and is managing to manage our event from Istanbul. Beat that. And also, I would mention Pat Swire, who has always been there as someone who can do things which need to be done at the right time. And we are absolutely thankful to her for the way she has supported this event as well. So many thanks to all of you. We've just got a message also here from Alison Carter. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you, John and Phil. And from Ida Haziri, thank you very much for this wonderful evening, John. Tracy McAvoy, thank you so much for a very illuminating evening, John. Well, Falaminderity Yith to Mirat, John and Phil from Jujin Alia. Good night, everyone, and thanks. So there we are. And from Malcolm B, excellent evening, thank you. Well, I think on that note, we will say good night and many thanks to all of you. And we hope to see you again soon. One thing did I mention the event that we are going to have, I think I did, in November, which will be our ambassador, our new ambassador in Tirana, who will be talking on or near Flag Day. So I hope we'll see you all again then. Many thanks and Natnemir.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.